Okay, now look at table 10.4. This is also very important one. The percentage distribution of potential gains from free trade. That is same, the simulation result of computable general equilibrium analysis. That is also static model instead of dynamic model. I already explained dynamic gain and static gain, right? This is just focus on static gains, right? So if I'm also one specialist expert in this area, most benefit comes from dynamic gains. Dynamic gains, right? Number two gains comes from services, right? And finally, goods, agriculture and manufacturing. Agri and manufacturing, right? But this analysis, skip this one. Also, analytical tools are static model instead of dynamic model, right? Just static model. Focus on free trade in goods, right? Then how to explain this? Actually, table 10.4 is really important. So economy, developed and developing. And number one scenario is full liberalization of agriculture and food. Full liberalization. So abolishment of tariff in agriculture by developed countries. Liberalization in agriculture by developing countries. Can you understand how to interpret this result? Or that is full liberalization of textile and clothing by developed countries. By developing countries. Full liberalization of other merchandise. Same. Right? So, in this table 10.4, right? Liberalization occurred, only reduction in tariff, right? Occurred in agriculture, right? By developed and developing, okay? And this is a total. Can you understand? And second column is liberalization of textile and clothing, textile and clothing, by developing, and by older countries. Third one is other manufacturing, other merchandise or other manufacturing. That is actually industrial sector. Goods. So goods sector means the agriculture plus manufacturing. Manufacturing decomposed into two, textile and clothing and other manufacturing. Why? Usually in this textile and clothing, developing country has comparative advantage, right? And other manufacturing industries, developed countries has comparative advantage, whereas developing country has comparative disadvantage, right? And agriculture, usually some developed country like Canada and Australia, and most developing country has comparative advantage in agriculture. But as I said before, some developing country like Indonesia do not want free trade in agriculture. So I explained some negotiating group like this. So finally, that is full liberalization of all goods. So liberalization in agriculture plus textile and clothing plus other manufacturing. That is full liberalization, right? So like this. Then, now think about if existing tariff eliminated, right? Eliminated, full liberalization happened. That means all tariff should be equal to zero in all countries, in all sectors. Then, national welfare, world national welfare increase greatly. That is something dollar. For example, something dollar. Okay? This something dollar is expressed, right? 100%. Right? Then you can explain this. Now think about 40% of total gains from full liberalization comes from liberalization in agriculture by developed countries. Got it? Right? And 70% of total, 100%, comes from liberalization in agriculture in developing countries. Right? So agricultural liberalization's contribution to gains from trade is this one plus this one. So what happened? 65%. Can you understand? Right? So from here we know that liberalization in agricultural sector by developed country is really important factor, increasing world production and gains from trade. Okay? And liberalization in textile and clothing in developed countries explains 6% of total gain. Liberalization of textile clothing by developing countries, 8%. Total 114% comes from textile sector. Right? Usually some developing countries are quite different with each other. Some successful developing countries, like China, India, and like this, who has a strong comparative advantage in manufacturing, right? And some countries like Vietnam, who show successful some performance in textile and clothing like this, right? But the other developing countries, right, has comparative disadvantage in manufacturing sector. So fully liberalized, 8% of gain happen, right? And liberalization in other manufacturing sector, just 3%. And that is 20% and 23%. So 55, 45. Can you understand? Now think about most important one here is this one. I already explained. 46% of total gains comes from liberalization in agricultural sector in developed country. So, as I said before, United States and EU and Cairns Group, developed and developing, and all developing countries want free trade in agricultural sector in negotiations. Only Korea, Japan, and Costa Rica and some Sweden, I forgot the name, Norway, like this, oppose free trade in agricultural sector. So nobody really seriously wants to listen Korean voice at all. Right? So this one is, so you have to understand background of this. And usually most of this comes from liberalization in agriculture in East Asian developed countries. Most of this 46% comes from liberalization of agricultural sector in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, like this. Can you understand? So that's the reason why Korea is wangda in this negotiation, DDA negotiation. Okay? And the number two thing is, this one is new. Usually in manufacturing sector, except textile and clothing, developed countries like Korea, Germany, Japan, right, has comparative advantage in this usually manufacturing sector. Okay? And most of the developing countries has comparative disadvantage in other manufacturing sector. So developing countries impose higher tariff on importing manufacturing goods. So if this tariff rate decreases greatly, right, 20% of trade gain, liberalization comes from liberalization of manufacturing sector in developing countries. Okay? Developing countries. That is number 2 component of this contribution to worldwide free trade gain. And what is number 3? This is the number 3 one. Right? Some also other developing countries has a comparative disadvantage in agricultural sector except food exporting developing countries. They oppose free trade. But if liberalization, all the remaining tariff abolished, then 17% of total gains comes from liberalization of agriculture in developing countries. Can you understand how to interpret this kind of thing? That is the reason why DDA is really difficult to reaching an agreement. Okay? Do agricultural subsidy in rich countries hurt poor countries? We learned in Chapter 9 that subsidies lower the world price of products. Right? So we studied the domestic support and export subsidy. Right? So this leading to decreasing world price. Since importing countries benefit from cheaper food, we already know that. Then importing countries' welfare increase. Right? So these countries adopting domestic support, export subsidy should be losers. Right? Why would poor countries who import food, right, want rich countries to remove their agricultural subsidies? That is the question. Right? Number 1 fact, only developed rich countries subsidize agricultural farmers. Why? Developing countries' fiscal situation is really bad. They have no money to support the poor people, agricultural farmers. So only developed countries, including Korea, use lots of money to support poor agricultural farmers. And in Chapter 9, we already studied that this kind of subsidy policies in developed country, right, result in lower price. That means poor developing countries can access to this agricultural good with cheaper price than otherwise. In spite of this fact, developing countries won't object developed countries' agricultural subsidy. Why? That is the question of this slide. Subsidies harm farmers in poor countries who compete with farmers in rich countries. Also, developing countries' agricultural farmers should be poorer than other sectors. Their life become worse than before, after liberalization. So they object. Okay? And poor developing countries have no money to support them. Right? So we know that in Korea, some subsidies of rice farmers, that is very popular, right? We use lots of money to support rice price, right? Lots of money is provided to agricultural rice farmers, Korean rice farmers, right? To keep some higher price. Okay, this one result in consumers. Because of this, consumers' price is very high, right? If this one is reduced, then consumer can purchase rice with cheaper price, right? Also, this kind of subsidies is quietly important. Actually, WTO, right? According to WTO, this kind of thing is not so good. Actually, government support for poor people is allowed in WTO system. So if government some support poor agricultural farmers, it's okay. But problem is that This one is linked to rice production, right? WTO, so one point WTO opposed to Korean rice price, some supporting policy is this one. Do not link support to market outcome, rice market, right? The linkage is a problem, right? And in some developing countries, object this kind of some agricultural subsidy policy by developed countries. Why? Actually, they do not have their money. So most of developing countries attack, criticize the agricultural subsidy in developed countries too. Okay. Okay. Table 10.5. This result is not so serious. Final section. Section 5 is preferential trading agreement. What is preferential trade agreement? Right. So we said PTA. So section 4 was WTO story. So multi-liberalization process. Multi-liberalization process. PTA means bilateral or regional liberalization process. Okay? So two things are different. Multilateral liberalization. Most of world countries join here. So one country reduce their tariff under the expectation that the other member countries reduce their tariff. Right? But in this PTA, bilateral or regional liberalization process means just member countries. Think about NAFTA, right? So US, Canada, and Mexico, right? US reduced their tariff under the expectation that the other two countries reduce their tariff, right? The member countries reduce tariff. But United States do not reduce tariff on imports from other countries, non-member countries. So something different thing happened in this PTA, okay? So PTA, trade agreements between countries in which they lower tariff for each other, but not for the rest of the world. But not for the non-member countries. Reduce tariff for member countries, but not for the non-member countries, okay? Under the WTO, such so in this sense, discrimination occurs, right? So in this sense, discrimination occurred. For example, US imposed 0% tariff on imports, TV set imports from Mexico. But United States imposed 10% tariff on, so for example, South Africa. So imports from South Africa. So different tariff rates imposed, member and non-member. Discrimination against non-member countries occurred. Because of this, we said preference. Under the WTO, such discriminatory trade policies are generally not allowed. Each country in the WTO promises that all countries will pay tariffs no higher than the nation that pays the lowest. We call that is most favored nation, MFN principle, right? So if member countries impose 1% tariff on imports from Korea, also the other countries also export under the system of 1% tariff. Okay? But in WTO, an exception is allowed only if the lowest tariff rate set at 0. Okay? Almost 0. So that means liberalization. Proceed fully. That should be an exception in that case. There are two types of preferential trading agreements in which tariff rates are set at or near 0. A free trade area, right? Free trade area, FTA, free trade area or free trade agreement. And some people said that is also PTA, preferential trade agreement, right? So Indian economists prefer this kind of idea, preferential trade agreement instead of free trade agreement. Why? They are very skeptical about regional integration. bilateral integration. Okay? Because discrimination. Right? A free trade area, agreements that allow free trade among members, but each member can have its own trade policy towards non-member countries. For example, NAFTA, right? NAFTA, United States imposed, for example, 10%, no percent tariff on imports from Mexico and Canada, right? But impose 10% tariff on, for example, Korean car, 0% when imported from member countries, but 10%. Okay? Well, what happened in Mexico? Mexico can impose, for example, 9% tariff on Korean car, right? Canada, for example, is 3% tariff on Korean car. So, member countries can impose different tariff when importing from non-member countries. Okay? That is this idea. Each member can have its own trade policy towards non-member countries, so they can impose different tariff rate. That is PTA. Example, NAFTA. And second type is custom union. Custom union means this one. A custom union, an agreement that allows free trade among members and requires a common external trade policy. Common external trade policy. So countries, right? No 0% between them. When they import cars, each country, member country imports Korean car, they impose same tariff. All the EU countries impose same tariff. Okay? That is meaning of external trade policy. Right? Common external trade policy. Example is the EU now. Preferential trading agreements necessarily good or national welfare. Right? So in the earlier slide, I said WTO rules is multilateral liberalization, but this kind of thing, discrimination happens. In spite of this, WTO allows FTA, right? FTA which having a discrimination thing. Why? Right? WTO thinks that in the longer term, this regional or FTA should be building block of worldwide free trade. Under this expectation, they allow FTA. But some requirements, that is, agreements, right, result in substantially no tariff, substantially lower tariff than before, right? Near zero, we already explained. And the other requirement is, in FTA term, most of some goods should be target of liberalization. Substantially all the trade in WTO terms. Substantially all the trade should be included in this FTA term. Can you understand? So anyway, this is good for national welfare from the perspective of member country. Right? No. It is possible that national welfare decrease under preferential trading agreement. Usually, so from here we know that after concluding FTA, national welfare increase. But in some special case, national welfare can decrease. Okay? So that is ideal. It is possible that national welfare can decrease. Usually increase, but sometimes decrease. How? Rather than gaining tariff revenue from inexpensive imports world market, a country may import expensive products from member countries but not gain any tariff revenue. For example, the real example is this one. Before Korea-EU FTA, Korea-Chile FTA, right? We import EU pork. We usually import pork from EU countries. Why? EU pork price is, for example, $10, right? And Chilean pork is, for example, $15, right? And before Korean-Chile FTA, we import, for example, 100% tariff. Then domestic price when we import EU4 is $10 multiplies 100%, or simply 1. So $2, right? And Chilean pork price in Korean market is $15, 1 plus 100%. So $30. So EU pork is cheaper than Chilean pork. So we imported EU pork. So this one is used for samgyeopsal, right? But after Korean-Chile FTA, then what happened? Korean-Chile FTA, no tariff on Chilean pork. But when we import EU pork, price is domestic price same, $20, right? But when we import Chilean pork, then what happened? 15, 1 plus, no, 0% tariff. So $15, right? So cheaper, domestic price, cheap, consumer price cheaper than EU pork. That's the reason why import of pork changed from EU to Chile after Korean-Chile FTA. Right? Then national welfare increase? We don't know. Right? Before Korean-Chile FTA, anyway, we collect tariff from EU pork. Right? This, and we moving here after Korean-Chile FTA, tariff revenue disappeared. Okay? Here, explain. Rather than gaining tariff revenue from inexpensive imports from worldwide, a country may import expensive. Importing price is $15. Right? When we import EU pork before Korean-Chile FTA, $10. So we import expensive Chilean pork. Okay? Because of this, a country may import expensive products from Chile, but not gain any tariff revenue. Because of this, sometimes national welfare decrease after Korean-Chile FTA. Okay? Preferential trading agreements increase national welfare. Usually, that is a usual case. Usually this happens. Exceptionally, this happens. Right? Why? Usually, increase national welfare when new trade is created. We said new trade is created. We said trade creation. We said trade creation, right? New trade is created, but not when existing trade from outside the world is diverted to trade with member countries. So we already studied this one. We said this is a trade diversion. That is a trade diversion, right? Trade creation means, for example, no import from foreign. Now, liberalized. Then we import new goods from other countries, banana and lots of fruit like this. Then domestic price decrease and national welfare increase. That is trade creation. Trade diversion means expensive, import price is higher than EU pork. Expensive, right? Expensive imports happen after FTA, from lower to higher price, higher importing price, right? That is trade diversion. That is explained here. Trade creation occurs when high-cost domestic production, domestic agricultural production, for example, is replaced by low-cost imports from other members. That is trade creation. Trade diversion occurs when low-cost imports, right, are diverted to high-cost imports from member countries, from Chile. Okay? Usually trade creation effect greater than trade diversion, so national welfare increase. But in special case, trade diversion effect prevail, more popular, overwhelms trade creation effect. Then national welfare can decrease. But that is a very skeptical view, usually by Indian economists. Okay? So now I finishes everything, right? So chapter 10, section 5, PTA. Earlier, section 4, multilateral liberalization process. Section 5, preferential trade agreement, right? Or FTA. And important thing in PTA is discrimination can be occurred. Violating MFN principle of WTO. Okay? But usually WTO allows this kind of discrimination under the expectation that this should be a building block for worldwide free trade. Under the and requires that this trade talk includes all the trade, substantial trade, and as a result of agreement, tariff rate should be very low, near zero. So, SEPA or something. Instead of FTA terminology, sometimes we use cooperative talks or something. Why? That is a violation after agreement. For example, impose 10% tariff or 20% tariff. That is violation of some WTO rules, right? So sometimes we can not use FTA terminology. So we said SEPA, CEPA, or like this. Okay? Anyway, the other important thing in PTA is the trade creation and trade diversion. So definition is important. And usually trade creation overwhelms trade diversion. So national welfare increases after FTA. But really special case, this one greater than this. Then national welfare decreases. Okay? This is end of chapter 10.